Well, it's a big welcome to Mastering Data for the Modern Day Education. My name is Jude Bolton. I'll be your host today, and we have an incredibly esteemed panel today. It's exciting to be talking about such an ever-changing environment. The education sector has been heavily impacted this year by COVID, as have many sectors. But this is a sector that is seeing incredible changing pace throughout, and so many challenges for our educators, for our parents, and for our students. And we'll be focused on greater student outcomes throughout this session. But we've got an incredible panel, and I'd like to welcome them all today. We've got Dr. Natasha Ziebell from Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Big welcome to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Jude. It's lovely to be here today.
Terrific. We've got Dr. Napoleon Radezno from Aquinas College, and he is Deputy Principal there. Lovely to meet you, Nap.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And we've got William Doherty, Xavier College Principal. Will, thanks for joining us.
Jay, terrific. Really pleased to be here.
And we've also got Lyndon Apthorpe, who's CIO of 9x5 Consulting, and they've got a leading solution around Education 360. And today we're going to have a really robust discussion and also some theory from the team as well, but really looking forward to stepping through and hearing from our esteemed panel. And Natasha, I'd like to start with you just on some of your background and your experience thus far.
Yes, of course. I am a primary school teacher by trade, but I did make the transition to initial teacher education, and I'm currently the coordinator of the Master of Teaching primary course at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. My research agenda really has centred around curricular alignment and the intended, the enacted and the assessed curriculum. And I'm really interested in how data is now being used to inform teaching and learning practices.
Fantastic. Napoleon, can you give a little bit of background on your experience?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jude. Look, as you mentioned, I'm the Deputy Principal at Aquinas College, Ringwood. This is my first year here, so it's been quite a baptism of fire, as it has been for all educators, I'm sure, out there in the world. My great interests are student voice and student empowerment. I've been teaching for the better part of 24 years. Through a number of different schools, predominantly Catholic schools from around Melbourne.
Fantastic. Bill Doherty, can you please give a bit of background on your experience and resume?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jude. So it's my third year in the principalship at Xavier College and at Xavier. I've probably travelled across 3 states and a little bit overseas as well. Xavier's about to probably embark on a pretty exciting voyage around data. Probably not dissimilar to many schools. We've got a raft of data suppliers and maybe questioning the effectiveness and the impact that we can make. So this is an exciting journey ahead, and COVID certainly has tipped so much on its head as well. So we're looking forward to the conversation ahead, Jude.
Fantastic. And in my work that I do with Domo, which is an enterprise analytics platform, I've come across Lyndon Apthorpe. Lyndon, as CIO, I'd love to just give you the opportunity to just give a little bit of background on yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jude. So, my background, I've got 20 years now working in predominantly consulting and very much a firm fixed data and analytics in virtually all sectors and industries, from telecommunications, healthcare, government, infrastructure and beyond, and more recently over the past couple of years in higher education and into K-12 space. So, yeah, very much a role focused on solving real-world business problems and school problems with data. So hopefully we can bring some good insights today. I'm looking forward to it.
Terrific. Well, Lyndon, I'll let you take control of the screen, and I know that you want to sort of set the scene around data because it is such a challenging environment thus far for so many educators and so many schools that are grappling with just this explosion of data. So feel free to take control.
Great. Thanks very much, Jude. And just bring that up. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak and present this information. The structure of what we're going to talk through right now is we're going to start with some fairly high-level concepts around the real trajectory of where data is heading, both at a global perspective and what the implications of that are on the education sector. And after I've spoken, then I'll hand it over to Natasha as well to kind of start to break that down in more of a very specific focus around the education sector. So we'll jump into a few different slides, but I wanted to start with a question with the idea of with a meter as the unit of measure. How far do you think you would travel if you took 30 linear steps? And fairly straightforward answer to that one. 30 linear steps is going to take you roughly 30 meters, or to put it into context and perspective, it will walk you from approximately the staff room to the classroom. And for the nature of this particular conversation, we're going to refer to this as human-generated data. So this is the data that we produce as people, and it's the things that we kind of have a one-to-one touch and relationship with. You could probably put it in the context of things like assessment-based activity with students within classes. That's a great example of what we would refer to as human-generated data, and it's an important point for us to keep in mind throughout this conversation. But however, if I was to ask you to take 30, instead of taking 30 linear steps, if you took 30 exponential steps, how far do you think you would actually travel? And it's quite substantial. 30 exponential steps, again, based on a meter of a measure, it's going to take you about 536,000 kilometers, or roughly 13.5 times around Earth. That's the nature of exponential growth and the comparison of exponentials versus linear. And we're in a world which is highly technology driven, and is more and more so becoming that case. And this is what we would refer to as the comparison of system generated data versus human generated data, and the implications and the impact that exponential growth has on the way in which we need to think through our systems and our processes to be able to match and accommodate this swell of information and data that's being produced in all areas of our life. So this is a great quote that just gives a bit of an indication of where we're going as far as data at a global scale. So by 2025, it's estimated that 463 exabytes of data will be created each day globally. And that's equivalent to roughly 212 million DVDs of information per day. It is an extraordinary amount of data, and it is growing, as we're talking about exponentially all the time, with new sources of information coming online all the time. And this little diagram that you see here just gives a few little data points as to what is data being produced every single minute of every single day of some of the key systems and platforms we're typically used to seeing. A couple I'll just quickly call out. For example, Zoom has now 208,000 participants in meetings every minute of every day. We've got Facebook producing 150,000 messages every minute, Instagram 347,000 stories. These are significant numbers, but what's really important, and I think something for us to really grasp here, is that this is what we would refer to almost as our consumer life, where we see this interaction and this explosion of data being produced. But it's through our consumer life that there's this downwards pressure that's now pushing into every industry and every sector that we work in, as our expectations of what technology is changes and how we adapt and evolve. This is really the nature of where it's coming from, and this is what's pushing into the education sector now, and is a real catalyst for us having to think through how we adapt to these types of changes. But this is all really fascinating, and exponential growth has some very significant impacts on our life. But what does it really mean for mastering data in education, and where does it actually come from? What are the causes? So I'm just going to quickly talk through the 6 Ds of exponential growth, which will hopefully help you understand where it comes from and why it happens, and then start to think through from your position in your school or whatever your role is how to actually look into the future a little bit and start to think through what the implications of these 6 Ds are on your school and the way you need to start to think and adapt to evolve with management practices. So the first step is digitization, the first D, and this is really the introduction of digitized equivalents of physical objects. When we move from the chalkboard to the smartboard, textbooks to ebooks, exercise books to Chromebooks, and everything that we're touching these days is really moving into a digitized form. And the key point to understand there is the data management in that. So for example, on the chalkboard, if you drew something up on the chalkboard back in the day, you rubbed it off, that data was gone. The best data transfer was maybe a student writing down whatever you wrote in their own workbook, in their exercise book, and that was as far as that data went. Now we move to smartboards, we're able to capture, print, interact with digital activities. This is a true representation of how we've moved from that physical object, and we're now starting to produce data in a digital form. And you can certainly get the same concept with these other ideas here. The next stage we move to, or the second D, is an interesting one called deception, which is it's not obvious that we're moving at an exponential rate. If you look at this graph at the moment, there's virtually our linear growth, our exponential growth are on the same line. They're not really doing anything. However, what we start to see is white noise and a significant fragmentation of data starting to happen in all of our life. And this could be the introduction of new classroom and learning apps coming online that you need to bring into the class, multiple sources of information, of data that you need to take from and input into, and significantly increase wrangling of different data points and reporting requirements that you need to kind of bring together into one place. So this is generally the first clue of deception starting to happen through that white noise. Then we move into a really interesting phase called disruption, this is where big problems can start to emerge, where we now start to get swamped in data. The pace of change is increasing all the time. And this is where we can actually see a rapid onset of new data-driven paradigms coming into our space and transforming change. And there's some classic examples of this if I step out of education. For example, like Apple moving into the music sector, or Airbnb moving into the accommodation sector, where they're no longer reliant on the physical assets that we're so typically used to using. They've effectively digitized and now taken a whole new paradigm and have driven a significant change in the market. And this can happen at any point in time and happen very, very rapidly. And it puts a lot of pressure on traditional models to have to adapt and evolve. And this is where we're finding that the education space is kind of not quite at the true disruption stage just yet, but it's very much on the move. We're seeing this in higher education, where the new online forms of education are coming on all the time and really challenging a lot of the more conventional styles of higher education. And this is now starting to creep also down into the K-12 space, as we're seeing. Really important point. But I think the next one is the most significant that we've all experienced, which I'll talk about firstly, which is dematerialization. And the dematerialization is effectively this complete transition from a physical reality into what I refer to as portal reality. And what do I mean by portal reality? So if we take 2020 as a perfect example of what's happened with COVID, where we went from happily in our classrooms, in our campuses, things were operating as normal, and then instantly overnight, we basically had to step away from that environment, dematerialize, and the entire education experience was transferred into the portals of iPads and laptops in lounge rooms and bedrooms all around the country, all around the world. And this was really this first significant push of dematerialization, albeit just transient. It's not a permanent change, but it was that first really significant moment where all of those physical assets just effectively vanished temporarily, and we then had to rely on portal reality. And just refer to some Zoom statistics just to quickly illustrate how this happens and what happens with data when we do move into this dematerialized phase. So you can see with Zoom, the daily peak meeting participants in December 2019 was roughly 10 million, when that's suddenly swelled to 200 million in March 2020, and then 300 million in April 2020. These are very, very significant numbers, and this is very much a result of that dematerialization and the transference of effort into some other form of communication being online in this particular case. You can see daily downloads, 56,000 to 1.7 million in Feb to 2.13 million in March. These are exponential growth patterns that we're seeing, and we know that it was used by or onboarded by 90,000 schools in 20 countries during COVID. So just Zoom alone, not taking into account any other applications, tools, software products that we use, just that in itself, you can see that drastic change that happened in our educational landscape, and just generally in the volume of data being produced through this COVID period. And it's really that knee in the curve that once it starts, this is where exponential growth becomes very, very significant and can start to create lots of challenges and problems for us to have to now wrap our head around how we're going to manage this into the future. The fifth one is demonetization. So this is where we move from nearly zero costs, and it's whatever we have is infinitely replicatable. And I think this image is a great example of what happens with dematerialization and demonetization, where back in the day, this is probably late 80s, early 90s, where we had all of these things, these gadgets and devices, physical assets that we had. All of this now basically fits on your phone, and you can share movies, you can communicate in any form you want to, all in a device. The cost, the price point of that has gone through the floor. And this is really another significant point with demonetization, because it now makes assets and resources available and accessible to virtually anyone, and can be just produced at such a significant rate. And this really is a point also that creates a lot of increased pressure on traditional models like education, and how we adapt to these new models where cost points of different ways of delivering communication, delivering education is changing all the time, and how do we adapt and evolve. And then lastly, once we have all of these Ds, we then move into the final point of democratization, which is effectively ubiquitous, universal access to assets, to resources, to technology that just continues to drive this exponential growth that we start to need to accommodate. This is very much a global view that I'm talking about there, but you can see it at a micro view starting to happen in individual schools and in the strategies of different educational sectors and how they're needing to evolve and bring in new communities that may not necessarily have had access to this information or to these resources in the past. It's now coming online. And I think a great image, I don't have it in the slide deck, but is a Maasai warrior standing with a mobile phone that basically has access to all of the information that has been produced in the world, all of those assets that we just showed in that image before, that is now effectively available to anyone globally at any point in time. And then lastly, just to bring all this together, this is now what it really starts to look like with this explosion of data and this downwards pressure of demand to have to adapt with new technology as we move through, where we've gone from this human-generated data environment where it was kind of the tip of the iceberg above the waterline, where it's what we could see and observe, it's what we could assess and what we're told and what we know. And now we're being rapidly thrown into this new world of human and system-generated data, where we now have a new modern footprint of education. And below the waterline, that underneath the water iceberg is now starting to understand, what are they doing, they being students? How are they interacting with the school and the systems that they're using? How are they engaged, not necessarily from an obvious perspective, but just their interactions with systems? How do they respond to changes in the strategies in the school, in new investments, in new capability? And then how are they impacted by these decisions? And this really now starts to make up the modern footprint of above the waterline and below the waterline. There is an immense amount of challenge involved in this and an immense amount of opportunity that also presents itself if we can harness this data. I'll take a pause for a moment. Jude, I'm going to hand back over to you or do you want me to hand straight to Nap?
Straight. Let's hand over to Nap. I'd love to bring our principals in just to have some comments around what they've seen. Particularly, you mentioned Lyndon around disruption and dematerialization. I'd love to get your thoughts, Dr. Napoleon Radezno, around how you've seen it in your school.
Yes, certainly. Look, all of the material that has been presented speaks very clearly to a need for schools to actually equip themselves with for such rapid changes. Certainly, the whole idea of what data has presented or can present to the school context has changed over time. But one thing that we can't get away from is that view of data being a snapshot. It provides us a really clear picture. It can provide a really clear picture of what the set of circumstances might actually be, whether it be for the individual student, a number of students, or the whole school community over a period of time. The availability now of technology to what it has actually become allows us to not only have one snapshot, but rather continuous snapshots that can actually then provide us with the scope for measurement, greater accessibility to measurement, not only to look at growth, but also to look at areas where we might be able to strategically increase student exposure to better the circumstances. One other thing too that in relation to what was actually just been mentioned there is that whole need about adaptability, the adaptability of staff and the adaptability of the school to be able to immerse into what it is that data might be able to provide.
No, fantastic, Napoleon. I really appreciate it. I might bring Bill Doherty in. Bill, I think Nap, you might have to pass over to Bill now, but just to add a little bit of context as well from what you're seeing at Xavier College.
Thanks, Jude, and thanks, Lyndon. I really appreciated the deep level of thinking that Education 360 and your product and your approach that you're taking. They often say that data is the new oil. I think if you follow the analogy through a little bit more, I mean, even oil these days is seeming a little bit outdated. So in an industry of incredible change that you've articulated really clearly, Lyndon, I think it's beholden upon any school community to think really clearly, really strategically about the architecture and about the base systems and platforms that we've got, so that the data that we're using is clean, it's usable, it makes sense to the staff, who many of whom aren't data experts themselves. But it will enable them to give them enormous confidence to use the data to drive that impact that we're seeking for the students that we serve. So, for my sake, I think it, as I said, it just requires deep but clear thinking around our systems and processes, so that we're really clear on the outcomes that we're trying to drive. And no doubt you'll unpack that a little bit more. So, Lyndon, I'll pass.
Just as before that, I just wanted to ask, how are you as an organisation able to pivot during this COVID time? It's obviously been extremely disruptive. How have some real life examples of your ability to pivot?
Yeah, I guess we're doing it in two ways. One, we've started a bit of a digitalisation or digital transformation strategy at the college, and thankfully that served us probably pretty well through the period of time. I think the COVID period is, the disruption's obvious, but the impact to teachers to be so much more time effective through this particular period. But it's also opening up really exciting new avenues of where we can, elicit feedback from students in new ways, deliver materials in new ways. That notion of flipped learning becoming so much more of a relevant concept, and we can actually look at the relational experiences that I think are so critical to schools, maybe being able to be magnified a little bit more, and some of those quite content-oriented elements being able to be redeployed remotely and in other ways. So it's been an interesting period, Jude.
Yeah, completely understand. And if any of our guests online need to ask any questions, we can take those in the portal. I'll get you, Bill, to hand over to Lyndon just to finish his little bit of theory.
Yep. So what does this actually look like? Here's a little bit of a map just of how the modern day school digital footprint is starting to change and what the implications are. And I won't go into detail about any of these, other than to kind of highlight that as our digital environment, the digital footprint starts to grow, there is more data sources, there's more inputs coming online all the time. And what's really important here, and from our perspective, in the way that we think about managing data, is that every one of these blocks, whether it's an administrative or an academic aspect of data being generated, all contribute in one way, shape or form to a better educational outcome for the students that attend that particular school. And it's through the relating of this information, bringing this and unifying it together, where you find really important and valuable insights that help you determine whether or not a strategic change or a tactical change in any one of these particular blocks or points can have a beneficial outcome for the student. So we don't make a delineation between academic and administrative, because it's all with the same goal of moving forward. And you'll start to see that these types of blocks will swell and grow more and more over time as more digital sources now come online. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that point. But coming back to our exponential and exponential data problem, and try to solve exponential data problems largely with our current human and linear systems and processes, is kind of like trying to bail water through a cyclone fence. We're just getting flooded, we're just being surrounded, and the harder you try, we're just going to be steamrolled and flooded by this onset of exponential growth in data. We need a better way to actually bring this together. We need an approach that really leverages both our human intelligence, our wisdom, our knowledge, and our experience as educators, and unifies this with the power, scalability, and capability of systematic process in a really effective and efficient way. And if I was to put it in essence, we really need to continue to think like educators, but we need to automate and process like a computer and with computers. But then once we've processed through with computers, we still need to analyze, interpret, and we want to take action on those insights being generated from that data like an educator. So this is not about doing away with educational experience. It's actually increasing and evolving and enriching it with the power of technology to be able to support that journey as we deal with this explosion of data. So last thing I'm going to quickly talk about before we hand over to Natasha is our data mastery pyramid. So this model that you see here is a methodology that we apply in virtually every sector, every industry, every type of organization to solve complicated data problems that really are the makings of the exponential growth problem we're facing ourselves with right now. And this same model and methodology applies exactly to education in the way that we want to think as educators. respond or process with computers, and then take action like educators. So I'll just quickly touch on each one of these layers just very quickly so you get an understanding of the framework here. So we always start with an objective, and in this case, an educational objective. This is what we want to achieve. It's the outcome or the goal where we want to go. It could be a strategic plan. It could be to progress students through an improvement in academic performance in a certain subject. It could be to increase the usage of the property and assets in some way. There's a whole raft of different goals and objectives, but effectively that defines the foundation of what we're trying to improve. The next layer, which is up, is our questions and context. Once we know what we want to improve, we now want to bring in the context and questions which help us answer what is it that we're trying to do to solve the problem, to make that improvement. Without questions and context, if we go straight to data and straight to metrics, you often find that it misses the mark because it's not answering the true context in the way that humans think through how do we solve the problem here. So that questions and context gives us a really nice foundation to then define at this next level the metrics and the measures that we need to produce and to create in order to be able to answer those questions to help us to achieve those objectives. So once we've defined those first three levels, which is really at the school and human, teacher and administrator level, we're thinking as educators, as I said before, now we move to the point of data, which is this unification of both your human-generated and your system-generated data, and having a means to bring these two things together so that we can now start to build those metrics and measures on top of, which now moves us into our next layer of technology, which is how do we connect to that data? How do we collect it and how do we store it so it's centralized for everyone within the school and institution to be able to use and leverage in a repeatable way? And how can we start to store it in a way that gives us historical trends, kind of tying back to what Napoleon was talking about before? So we want a repeatable methodology and as much as possible an automated way to collect this data from across the institution so that we can really start to build on top of that. The next level is what I would refer to as effective and efficient and automated data wrangling. So this is where a lot of teachers we find spend a lot of time massaging and manipulating data from multiple systems and trying to bring it together to form a cohesive view of what a student looks like. At this cleanse, blend, and prepare layer, this is where we're leveraging technology to do that for us. We're setting up processes and procedures from a functional perspective that can take data, manipulate it, cleanse it, combine it with other information, and then produce another data set on the back of that now is in the structure that we need. And we haven't had to manually intervene too much with people having to wrangle spreadsheets. Another really important step in the process to get us to those insights. Now we have our data, we want to visualize, we want to analyze. So we want to transfer the time and effort from administrators and academic staff within the school, from the wrangling, from this cleanse, blend, prepare layer. We want to move them up into the visualize and analyze layer where data is being presented to them and they can spend more time exploring the insights rather than wrangling the data. And then once we have those insights being generated, what we want to do to reduce the fragmentation of data scattered across the school and conversations happening in different emails or different classrooms or wherever it may be, we want to bring people to that data, to those insights, and now start to have collaborative conversations around that data so that we're centralizing that intellectual property and wisdom of all of the staff within the school into one central place, and we don't have that issue of lost knowledge and lost insight that it just often disappears, and that happens in any organization. And then the fifth layer on that technology layer is optimizing and automating. And this is really getting to the point of once you've got your visualizations and you're now starting to understand what success looks like, or failure, for want of a better term, looks like, how can we put thresholds, KPIs and targets in place so that when your data is updated automatically, your data's blended, your reports and charts now start to update with the most up-to-date information, you're being notified instantly when something needs your attention because you've either gone above or you've missed a target or a key goal or a key KPI. It's something that needs your attention to actually go and solve. And then lastly, once we have all of this kind of funneling up, and we're really focusing in on what's the key thing that we need to focus on, we come to the last point, which is the people aspect of taking action and getting those outcomes that we're looking for, which is the most critical point here. There's no point having all this data being generated if you don't have people as educators taking those insights, taking that action, and then closing the loop back down to our educational objective, which now really becomes a virtuous cycle of improvement with a very repeatable model that you can continuously apply through your school at any particular data problem that you need to solve. So that's it. That's our framework. I'm now going to hand over to Natasha to start to explore from the academic perspective a little bit more and what she's seeing in the sector as well.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that. There's some seriously impressive numbers there and mind-boggling statistics that you've just presented, Lyndon. Today, what I'd like to do is focus on data that relates to teaching and learning at the classroom level, and also share some thoughts about the purpose of data, why we're generating data, for what purpose, and how we use that and close the loop to inform teaching practices in the classroom. This is a lovely quote that I'd just like to share with you. I think it flows on nicely from some of the concepts that Lyndon's introduced. Lorna Earle was instrumental in the late 1990s, early 2000s, particularly when we had a new curriculum implemented. So Lorna Earle really set the scene for assessment, building on the seminal work of Black and William. And we started thinking about assessment differently in terms of the formative and summative aspects and assessment for, of, and as learning. But in 2005, Earle said that educators are trying to come to grips with this vast deluge of new and unfiltered information and to find ways to transform this information into knowledge and ultimately into constructive action. Now, the lovely thing about this quote is that it's from 2005. I want you to think about what you were doing in 2005. As far as the educational landscape goes, we were moving from an outcomes-based curriculum from the CSF, and this was the year that the essential learnings were rolled out across Australia in various forms. So we had the bells here in Victoria. In 2005, you definitely did not have a smartphone, and it wasn't until 2010 that we saw the first iPads being distributed. This is before Axel and Akara, before visible learning and learning progressions. So when I look at this quote and reflect on this quote, I do remember still having a physical grade book, that pale blue grade book at around this time that we were still holding on to while some were making that transition to putting some of our data into Excel spreadsheets. I think, look, I've been a teacher for the best part of 25 years, and I think schools have always been data-rich environments, and using data has always been a very important part of a teacher's role. However, that has increased significantly, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years, with the introduction of visible learning, with the introduction of accountable systems. It's really become quite difficult to manage the data and to also ascertain what purpose we're generating it for. Is it for accountability? Is it for communication? We now have continuous assessment for reporting to parents. A whole lot of programs have been developed now to provide feedback both to teachers, to students and to parents. But at the moment, I think we're actually really at a very critical juncture in time where we now have the technology, we have exciting technology that is going to help bring together some of these really great initiatives that have occurred in the past. And I'm talking about curriculum reform, assessment initiatives, and also school-based initiatives. Research that is fed into that, such as things like visible learning, and response to intervention programs where we're really looking at our 3 tiers of instruction in classroom to cater for all students. So the individual students that need that one-to-one support, the small groups of students, and then of course the whole class. I've got these 3 terms here up on this slide: teaching practices, evidence-based, data-informed and research-informed. I've actually seen quite a growth in the use of these terms, particularly on school websites, but also in describing teaching practice. So what constitutes evidence as part of an evidence-based approach? I actually think saying we're using an evidence-based approach is quite a big claim. I think my definition of using an evidence-based approach is establishing what a student knows and then what they are ready to learn next using assessment information. Now, it's not that simple, because when you're making a judgment about student progress, you also need to draw on research. Research is one form of evidence that informs teaching practice. We know that there are typical progressions in terms of how most children might learn in a sequence, in a developmental sequence. We also know that there are common misconceptions for learning particular content areas. So, for example, we know that students that see a triangle with rounded or a triangular shape with rounded corners, we'll call that a triangle. So we know that there still needs some more information and more knowledge about the attributes of two-dimensional figures. So teachers are the content and pedagogy experts. They know what needs to be taught. The research can certainly support common misconceptions and teaching approaches that address those misconceptions. What I find is trickier is actually finding those diagnostic assessments that are comprehensive enough that will be able to identify what that particular misconception is. So we used research as one form that will inform our practice. We also have other things like professional learning and classroom evidence that is generated day to day. Some of that is informal and in the moment. Other research, other classroom evidence we use are the types of assessment tasks that are planned for, summative tasks that we put together. All of these elements do need to be considered as a whole. And I've been doing a lot more thinking recently about how we might curate this evidence in a way that can be easily interpreted. And it's one thing to actually generate it and interpret it, but then use it again, close that loop and use it to inform teaching practice. So how do we interpret and use that evidence? So bringing all of these together, I think having a data-informed approach to draw out those performances and the performance levels of students in your classroom alongside the curriculum standards, which tell us what the expected level is, but certainly using the research in those areas and using empirically based progressions, which are getting better all the time. There's a lot more research now being conducted in that area to constitute an evidence base to inform our teaching. Now, I just wanted to quickly doff my hat to the curriculum. We have had significant curriculum reform, and with that, I think a wider range of initiatives that have reflected that. This gives us a common reference that are based on the standards, and it helps us to establish some baseline data for the students, both at the classroom level and at the school level. The way I see it, some of the things are easier to generate data and use at a school level than other things. So, for example, some of the standardised tests like Napoleon and the progressive achievement tests in maths and reading, they can be used fairly easily, plugged into a system, and you can have a look at trends across not only your current cohort, but also previous cohorts. That also I'm talking about numeracy and literacy there. However, we also need to extend it to all areas of the curriculum. We've got our 8 learning areas, we've got our 3 cross-curriculum priorities, and we've got 7 capabilities. And in Victoria, we've got 4 with the Victorian curriculum, depending on where you're coming from. But whichever curricula or version or iteration of the Australian curriculum that you're using, it is 3-dimensional, and we do need to start thinking about how we're generating data about those complex learning tasks that incorporate the capabilities, because we know how essential they are for students that move beyond their school and into work and life. So life beyond school. So our data needs to represent the breadth of the curriculum. Numeracy and literacy are important, but the curriculum is a lot more complex than that. There are, as I said earlier, there are some great progressions that are being developed now for things like critical and creative thinking or collaborative learning. And I think using data analytics to bring all of that together will give us a more holistic picture of where students are at. It will give us our baseline data that we can monitor over a period of time. I worked on a project last year, and we were looking at student progress. And through asking a series of questions and looking back through data, there was a student that hadn't made progress in a couple of years. Now, those students, sometimes they can slip through the cracks. So it's really important that not only data is being used to inform the next instruction, which is absolutely fine, we also need to be looking back and seeing whether we're actually getting that year's growth for a year's input for each student. And if not, Why not? And do we need to then think about some targeted one-to-one interventions and perhaps looking at doing some further diagnostic testing beyond education, looking at psych and speech pathology? Now, the way I like to think about data in schools is that we're really moving from collecting data to generating data. When thinking about data, the metaphor of a data palette I find is really useful. Everything that a child says, does, makes or writes in a classroom can be assessed and recorded in some way. Now, we're not going to do that because that's absolutely exhausting, and we don't have the data entry specialist sitting there next to us in the classroom being able to enter all that information. We do have a wide range of data sources, including formative and summative assessment data. We have work samples, portfolios, checklists, anecdotal records, and even the informal assessments that we do. And we have the standardised tests, NAPLAN and PAT. And I think it's really important to have that balance between the qualitative and the quantitative data because they do complement each other and tell you a story about a child's learning, and they're both important in a classroom context. I don't think it's about testing students more or necessarily collecting more data. I think it's about being strategic in what kind of data. So looking at that data palette and saying, right, what are we using? What are we collecting, first of all, and is it useful to us? If you collect data and then store it, it has absolutely no impact whatsoever on teaching and learning. It's just sitting there. And in fact, I have been in schools where, you know, a lot of great work is being done through moderation and assessment processes. However, the students are moving and the teacher are moving on to the next topic, so they don't get to loop back and do anything with that assessment. So I know it's very busy, we talk about the crowded curriculum, but being able to use assessment in real time to be able to make teaching decisions, I think is one of the most beneficial ways. And if that's what we're moving towards, it's going to be incredibly exciting. Generating data is different to collecting data. So when we generate data, we have the end in mind. So that includes defining the purpose we need the data for, and then selecting the assessment tools that will elicit those performances in the classroom context. The generating data has a purpose, so it can then be used for assessment that does come back to your practice, and it becomes a means for modifying that next instruction. Last year, my colleague Gemma Skeet and I developed an evidence-based reasoning model to support decision-making at the classroom level. And a critical aspect of evidence-based reasoning is data generation and also the interrogation of that data. And some of the questions from that research study are there. It's more comprehensive than I've presented there. But these are the questions that we need to ask. We need a data management plan. We need to measure and think about what our potential data sources are and use them strategically. In terms of purpose and practice, there's varied purposes for generating data. We measure performance, we inform curriculum design and curriculum planning. It can support decision-making, both the short-term, mid-term and longer-term decision-making. Monitoring progress over a longer period of time, measuring growth in learning over time, and especially thinking about those initiatives that are working. And we can also demonstrate impact to stakeholders. And by that I mean principals, leaders, teachers, teaching teams, parents, students. But I think we need to become more data literate overall and build statistical literacy in teaching teams so that they can analyse data and ensure its transferability into practice. We need the data to be productive. I think the power of the data lies in the valuable information that it provides. We do need good data management practices and the additional support for teachers through professional learning and time to engage with these processes. While there are some challenges, I think generating data that informs teaching practice and improves student outcomes has to be the goal. And if these aspirations are to be realised, then we need the systems in place that are secure, they contain valid data and can be accessed efficiently. The data can also be used for evaluating impact and creating new approaches to meet student needs. So ultimately, an improvement in the systems does have the potential to lead to informed instructional improvement. Thank you all. I'll just pass back to
Yeah, thank you so much, Natasha. That's amazing. Just the level of research that you've taken us into today. I guess I'd like to ask our principals now. I know we know teachers are responsible for the delivery of education to tomorrow's leaders, but as a principal or even some of the business managers in the audience today, I guess I'm just really interested to know, what role data and analytics play for that, in driving that continuous improvement and achievement of your organizational objectives, I guess, and those strategic goals. If I bring Nap in now to speak now, Nap, what's your thoughts?
Look, this whole notion of data use and its implementation within what we do in terms of our practice in schools has been something that has driven the agenda for quite some time now. And I do believe that we are in an exciting time. I think, we have been impacted by the COVID situation, the pandemic, and the way that this data is not only being collected and as Natasha mentioned, it's not only how is it being collected, how is it actually being implemented and used. And I think that there have been a lot of really good. Certainly, we've met some really, really strong goals, I think, as school communities in general. One of the things I will say about the importance of the data use in education in terms of our way forward is that, we are in a situation where we don't know what the future actually holds in terms of even from an infrastructure point of view, the employment of the future, different jobs that are being generated time and time again. And I think that the use of data to learn not only how the one individual student learns as part of a community, but rather what can we actually learn about the individual student within that is very, very valuable.
Napoleon, I was keen to ask, are we putting too much pressure on our educators to learn new platforms and new systems? It's been such a thrust. We talked about, the volume of data and that deluge, but what about our educators? What sort of pressure, I guess, from all stakeholders are they under at the moment?
Yeah, look, certainly, I guess for, the amount of information, and I think it was mentioned earlier that, the amount of training that a lot of our staff would actually have, generally speaking, most schools, it's actually limited to perhaps what they might have done through statistics, perhaps when they were high school students themselves. Some are a little bit more fortunate to be learning on the job, but certainly professional learning, professional development is very, very critical. Without an understanding of how to actually bring data together to inform some of our practice, it is very difficult for it to come into fruition. So certainly having an ability to align all the platforms together, having an ability to actually put all the concepts together and understanding how do they actually speak to one another is very, very important.
So in that sense, if we delve a little bit more, we look at the corporate world and organizations that are employing chief data officers, data stewards, and chief digital officers. Do you see schools resourcing differently over those next few years to be able to manage that as well?
Yeah, certainly. Traditionally, it's been left to in the hands a lot of the time of an executive team or a leadership team to have a person who might oversee some of these things. But often the transformation of what that actually means and how does it impact in the actual classroom, it's something that is very, very critical. And I would suspect that, well, I suggest that a lot of schools have already moved into an area of looking at people with a background in data analysis and having a focus of what impact that can actually have on the measurement of student development across different subject areas or different areas of engagement and learning.
If I just bring Bill Doherty in from Xavier College in now, I guess, Bill, we look at the Gonski report came out in 2010. It, showed some growing gaps between, wealthy and disadvantaged schools. I guess, what role does technology play in your eyes as that enabler? And I guess, for schools not falling behind?
Yeah, thanks, Jude. I think you're right on. I think one of our jobs, and almost Bill's to your earlier point, our job as leaders and administrators or managers within schools is to provide real clarity and insight and make that simple for the people who are the critical enablers for the data being used. So, data is, I would sense, it's no good unless it's live. There's no point. I speak often about having a headlights view rather than the rear vision view of a car as we move forward. There's no point sort of crying over last year's results. The merit is in actually being able to impact on this year's results and this year's students right now. So you talk of some of those reforms, and often reforms get clogged down and aren't effective because of the inability to actually really clearly perceive what the difference is and actually bring that to life. So I think that's, for me, exactly where this data conversation is at. Natasha used a lovely line before of, curating evidence so that it's easily interpreted. So I think our role in schools is to ensure that the critical questions are being asked so that we obtain the critical evidence to drive the critical questions and to drive the critical conversations. And out of that, you can get the outcomes and results you're after.
So, Bill, just to add on that is, with that transition, as we've seen, back into traditional educational settings, what learnings and opportunities have come out of that forced remote learning view that we've had, and where do you see the opportunity to fuse those traditional methods with the evolution of education delivery?
Yeah, good question, Jude. I think quite clearly, as I was referencing before, a notion of how we present information differently, and that's to a series of different audiences. I think we've certainly experienced some great success in those remote online parent-teacher conferences and in parent information sessions. So how we can do that differently, I think people will there's a commodity on time, and so therefore how we're able to be respectful of people's time and therefore duly impactful. So the engagement rate that we saw around parent-teacher interviews being done online when people were in their own settings with both sets of parents who might be in different locations through work, even though that was a little bit limited with COVID.
Yeah.
It certainly made for productive conversations. And again, then when you can bring data in on an ongoing basis to that, we speak often of continuous reporting, and I guess that speaks to my point around live data. There's no point in presenting a report at the end of a semester only to figure out that if some interventions could have taken place earlier, that report card and the child's experience might have been enormously different. I think the same is true of data. If the data is live and it's continuous and people are working with it in insightful ways and easy to use ways, that will drive the outcomes that we need, because they'll be able to, in real time, be able to action the critical interventions.
Are there any more impacts you're seeing that tech's having in today's, classroom and in and around, from an admin perspective, or even, parents' expectations? Managing that is such a difficult one for schools at this point.
Yeah, very true, Jude. I think, there's an expectation now around feedback, and often that's driven by industry. The experience they get from Telstra or Qantas or, whoever they might be engaging with, that then sets the new normal, if you like, for what they'd expect out of a school. So it's no longer good enough for a school to be able to sit and say, oh, this is how education does it. Well, this is how society's doing it, and how are we learning, adapting as schools. So I think the pressure, and rightly so, is on us. But I think that's the opportunity and the exciting factor to say, how might we be able to present with a sense of customer service and a real sense of impact and insight? How can we actually present and give our feedback so much more insightfully than how we've previously done it? So it's the innovators in the space, and again, maybe I'll draw back to that notion of Education 360 and how it can actually provide elements of real clarity. Risk and governance would be other areas, so that we're actually providing a sense of confidence, whether it be to parents in a school community, or whether it be to governance in terms of the direction that we're taking, that we're actually hitting the benchmarks that we said that we would.
Terrific, Bill. If you just pass over to Natasha, I'd love to bring you into the conversation again, Natasha. Just how do you see the industry, embracing the evolution over these next 24 months, and trying to make data and analytics part of the fabric of how schools work?
Thank you. I think you mentioned Gonski earlier. The most recent Gonski report looks at through growth to achievement, and the number of times something like learning progression and growth had been mentioned it was over 100 times. The findings and also the recommendations are really quite clear in terms of how we use data in schools. And I think coming into the next 12, 24 months, there's some really great opportunities here. we've had a difficult year this year, but I think also that experience has actually highlighted what traditional practices are really effective, what we really can't compromise on in the school setting. We also now know too, more so than ever, the affordances that technology gives us in terms of communication, interaction, and engaging in learning. So I think we're at a point now with visible learning. We've got our curriculum. We have learning progressions being developed. And now we have the technology and the tools to be able to consolidate all of that. And as Bill said, in real time, so that it can impact on next instruction, not next year, not sometime in the future. It's immediate. And I think if we can somehow harness that, it's going to have a great impact on student outcomes. And that's our goal. That has to be our goal.
Terrific. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time today. And I'll pass back to Lyndon now. We've had some incredible guests in terms of having Dr. Natasha Ziebell providing your insights and research. Incredible. Dr. Napoleon Radezno from Aquinas College, and also Bill Doherty from Xavier College as well. Lyndon, I just wanted you to, I guess, close this off and, just maybe some final thoughts from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jude, and thanks very much, everyone, for the great insights in the conversation. I think it's certainly a very exciting time for where education is heading. There's certainly a lot of challenges that we need to really be working to overcome, and it's just great to really get a bit of a sense as to what's happening from a theoretical perspective, but then also how this is playing out in a practical sense. From my perspective, coming from a more corporate enterprise world where there is and has been for a long time a real sense of an importance of really robust data management practices and really having the finger on the pulse of what's happening in kind of near real time, to bring some of those concepts back that Bill and Natasha just talked about. The capability, both from a theoretical but also from a functional perspective, is something that's going to become ever more important within schools. Schools are getting really good at bringing in the right applications to deliver the right things, whether they be learning management systems or school management systems, student management systems, you name any system that a school needs, and they've pretty much got one of them or possibly two, like most organizations do. But it's really, how do we bring all of this data now together in a centralized way and really applying some of those more really well-tested and well-worn business management practices into the school to support both the academic and the administrative processes. Just tie back to what I said earlier, is that every function within a school, whether you're a teacher or an administrator, everyone's contributing to the ongoing improvement of the educational outcomes for students and for the school as a whole. And that does require a sense of capability to sit over the top of all of those different sources and systems to really enable that real-time capability. But as I said before, and tying back to the pyramid we mentioned, there does need to be a methodology, a really thoughtful and repeatable way to be able to do that. And through that combination of methodology and technology, we can really start to help schools wrap their arms around these data problems and set themselves up nicely to accommodate these changes that are happening at a fairly rapid pace. So really big changes happening, and that's where I'm very much seeing a merge starting to happen between the way in which schools operate and the way in which corporate and enterprise work. There is really a bit of a shift in that happening. And the last thing I just want to add, as I suppose a call to action or next steps, if anyone on the call is interested, we will be running another webinar in 2 weeks from now on the 11th of November, which is applying data mastery pyramid in your school, and really stepping through each one of these layers at a much deeper level and actually looking at some practical applications from that, that you can start to think around how you could take this methodology and apply this into your school. And we really want to arm those people in schools who are really starting to think through these processes, how they can leverage their data in this very repeatable way. So we will send out an invitation to those on the call and give you an opportunity to come along and join in on that conversation. Hopefully it's valuable and insightful, and really will help for you to be able to move your school forward.
Terrific, Lyndon. Much appreciated. And once again, thanks for our esteemed panelists. Really enjoyed your engagement and thoughts. So thanks very much for joining.